Seven-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton has everything: fame, fortune, and a legendary racing career. But at 39, the superstar has made a heartbreaking confession that explains why he's never settled down or started a family. In an exclusive interview, Hamilton revealed the devastating childhood secret he's carried for nearly 3 decades. It's not about being too busy with racing or not finding the right person. The truth is far more painful, and it all traces back to a single moment when he was just 12 years old. "I've given up on having kids," Hamilton told longtime friend and journalist Marcus Chen during a quiet conversation in Monaco. But it's not what people think. What happened next would change everything we thought we knew about the racing legend, revealing a story of childhood trauma, survivor's guilt, and a promise he made to himself that shaped every relationship he's ever had. The real reason Lewis Hamilton fears fatherhood isn't what anyone expected, and when you hear his story, you'll understand why he spent his entire adult life believing he's too dangerous to love. The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but Lewis Hamilton kept stirring it anyway. Round and round, small silver spoon clinked against the white ceramic cup. His eyes stared out at the Monaco harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys in a bathtub. Marcus Chen sat across from him at the small cafe table. The journalist had known Lewis for 15 years. They had shared hotel lobbies in Shanghai and restaurant tables in São Paulo. Marcus had watched Lewis win championships and lose them, but he had never seen his friend look this tired. "You said you wanted to talk," Marcus said gently. His notebook lay closed on the table between them. "About your future plans." Lewis nodded, but didn't speak right away. December in Monaco was quiet. Most of the racing crowd had gone home until the season started again. The cafe was nearly empty, except for an old man reading a newspaper by the window. "I'm 40 next year," Lewis finally said. His voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of waves against the harbor wall. "People keep asking me about settling down, about having kids." Marcus had heard these questions too. Every interview seemed to include them. When would the 7-time world champion start a family? He was successful, wealthy, famous. What was he waiting for? "And?" Marcus prompted. Lewis set down his spoon. His hands were steady, but Marcus noticed the small muscle jumping in his jaw. It was the same look Lewis got before difficult races. Focused but scared. "I've given up on having kids, mate," Lewis said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. A seagull cried somewhere over the water. The old man turned a page of his newspaper with a soft rustle. Marcus waited. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best question. "It's not what people think," Lewis continued. He picked up his coffee cup, then put it down without drinking. "It's not about finding the right person. It's not about being too busy with racing." Lewis looked directly at Marcus for the first time since they had sat down. His brown eyes were bright with unshed tears. "There's something I've never told anyone," Lewis said. "Something that happened when I was 12. Marcus felt his heart rate pick up. In all their years of friendship, Lewis had never mentioned being 12. He talked about winning his first kart race at 8. He talked about meeting Ron Dennis at 14. But 12 was a blank space in Lewis's stories. "What happened when you were 12? Marcus asked. Lewis's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. For a moment, Marcus thought his friend might get up and leave. Lewis had done that before when conversations got too personal. But Lewis stayed in his chair. He took a deep breath. "We were on holiday," Lewis began. "Cornwall. My whole family went. My dad, my stepmom Linda, my little cousin Emma." His voice caught on the name. Emma was 5. Blonde hair. Always laughing. She loved the beach. Lewis paused. A waiter walked by their table, carrying a tray of pastries. The smell of fresh bread mixed with salt air from the harbor. "We went to Newquay Beach," Lewis continued. "It was a beautiful day. Sunny, warm. Emma wanted to go swimming. She was so excited." Marcus noticed that Lewis's breathing had gotten faster. Shallow. Like he had just finished a long run. "The water looked calm," Lewis said. "But there were currents. Dangerous ones. Emma went in first. She was a good swimmer for her age. But..." Lewis stopped talking. He stared out at the Monaco harbor again. A ferry was coming in from Italy. its horn echoing off the buildings. "But what?" Marcus asked softly. Louis closed his eyes. She got caught in a rip current. One minute she was laughing and splashing. The next minute she was screaming. Going under. The old man at the window folded his newspaper and left. The cafe felt even quieter now. Just Louis and Marcus, and the weight of an old secret. "I jumped in after her," Louis said. His eyes were still closed. "I was 12, but I was strong. I had been swimming since I was little. I thought I could save her." "Did you?" Marcus asked. Though something in Louis's face told him the answer was complicated. Louis opened his eyes. They were wet now. "I got to her. I kept her head above water until the lifeguards came. She was unconscious, but she was breathing." Marcus waited for the rest. There had to be more. This sounded like a hero story, not a reason to give up on having children. At the hospital, Louis continued. "I heard the doctors talking. Emma had been without oxygen for too long. There might be brain damage, they said. Permanent damage." Louis picked up his coffee cup again. This time he took a sip, made a face at the cold liquid, and set it down. "She lived," he said. "But she was never the same. Never would be the same. Because I wasn't fast enough. Because I didn't reach her in time." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He was beginning to understand. "Louis," he said carefully, "you saved her life." Louis shook his head. "I ruined it. If I had been faster, stronger, better, she would have been fine. Instead, she needed help with everything. Walking, talking, eating. Her whole family fell apart trying to take care of her." "That wasn't your fault," Marcus said. "Wasn't it?" Louis's voice was sharp now. Angry. "I was the one who said we should go swimming. I was the older cousin. I was supposed to protect her." Marcus wanted to argue, but he could see that Louis wasn't ready to hear it. This guilt had been growing inside his friend for almost 30 years. "After that," Louis said, "I promised myself I would never be responsible for another person like that again. Never put someone in danger because of my choices. So you decided not to have children." Marcus said, "I decided not to risk it." Louis corrected. "What if I made the wrong choice again? What if I couldn't protect them? What if my decisions hurt them the way they hurt Emma?" Louis stood up suddenly. His chair scraped against the stone floor of the cafe terrace. He pulled out his wallet and left enough money for both their coffees. "I can't," he said, looking down at Marcus. "Not yet. But maybe it's time people knew why I am the way I am." Marcus watched his friend walk away, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Louis's shoulders were hunched against the December wind. He looked smaller than usual, younger. Marcus sat alone at the table for a long time after Louis left. The harbor was getting busy with the afternoon ferry traffic. Tourists with cameras wandered the streets looking for famous faces. He thought about all the times people had asked Louis about his personal life. All the jokes about the famous bachelor who dated models but never settled down. The speculation about whether he was too selfish or too focused on racing to be a father. None of them had been close to the truth. Marcus opened his notebook and began to write. He had a feeling this was only the beginning of Louis's story, and he suspected the ending would break more hearts than just his own. The coffee cup sat empty on the table. Louis had left it there, still stained with the coffee he couldn't finish. Like so many other things in his life that he had started but couldn't complete, the waiter came to clear the table. He looked at the money Louis had left and smiled. It was twice what the coffee cost. "Your friend," the waiter said to Marcus in accented English. "He comes here often. Always sits alone. Always looks sad." Marcus nodded. He was beginning to understand why. Outside, the December sun was setting over Monaco. The expensive cars drove by with their engines purring. The yachts rocked gently in the harbor. Everything looked perfect and peaceful. But Marcus knew now that some stories were more complicated than they appeared. Some secrets were too heavy to carry alone. He closed his notebook and walked out into the evening air. Tomorrow, he would call Louis. Tomorrow, he would ask if his friend was ready to tell the rest of his story. Tonight, he would just think about a 12-year-old boy who tried to save someone he loved and spent the rest of his life believing he had failed. Stevenage, England. Summer. Lewis Hamilton was 2 years old when his parents split up. He was too young to remember the fights or the tears. All he knew was that sometimes he lived with his dad Anthony in the small house on Pear Tree Way, and sometimes he visited his mum Carmen in her flat across town. The house on Pear Tree Way was always busy. Anthony worked 3 jobs to pay the bills. In the morning, he fixed cars at the local garage. In the afternoon, he painted houses. At night, he cleaned offices in the city center. When Anthony wasn't working, he was either sleeping or thinking about go-karts. "One day, son," Anthony would say, lifting 5-year-old Louis onto his shoulders, "you're gonna be a racing driver. A real one, like Ayrton Senna." Louis didn't know who Ayrton Senna was, but he knew his dad's eyes got bright when he said the name. The same way they got bright when he talked about engines and speed and winning. By the time Louis was 8, the go-kart had become the center of their world. Anthony had bought it used from a man in Hertford. It was red and silver with scratches on the sides and an engine that coughed when it started. But to Louis, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "This is your chance," Anthony told him the first day they took it to the track. "Work hard, listen carefully, and maybe you can have a different life than me." Louis didn't understand why his dad wanted him to have a different life. Anthony seemed happy enough, even when he was tired, even when the bills came in the mail and made him frown at the kitchen table. But Louis loved the go-kart anyway. He loved the smell of fuel and rubber. He loved the way the engine vibrated through his whole body. Most of all, he loved going fast. At Rydell School, Louis was good at sports but struggled with reading. The letters seemed to jump around on the page. Sometimes B looked like D, and sometimes words got mixed up in his head. Mrs. Sarah Whitfield, his teacher, was patient with him. She would stay after school to help him sound out difficult words. "You're very smart, Louis," she would say. "Your brain just works differently than other children's. That's not a bad thing." Mrs. Whitfield noticed other things about Louis too. When the younger children fell down in the playground, Louis was always the first one to help them up. When they were scared, he would sit with them until they felt better. "You have a good heart," she told him one day. "You care about people. That's a special gift." Louis liked Mrs. Whitfield, but he didn't feel special. He felt confused most of the time. About his parents, about school, about why some things were easy for him and others were so hard. The only place he felt clear was at the go-kart track. On Saturdays, Anthony would load the cart into their old van and drive to tracks around England. Louis got better every week. He learned to take corners without slowing down. He learned to find the fastest line around the track. He learned to push the cart to its limits without losing control. But more than that, he learned that when he was racing, nothing else mattered. Not his parents' divorce. Not the words that wouldn't stay still on the page. Not the worried look Anthony got when he paid for fuel and tires and entry fees. When Louis was behind the wheel, he was just speed and focus, and the need to win. Other families noticed him too. The Hamiltons didn't have as much money as most of the other racing families. Their equipment was older, their clothes were worn, and they ate packed sandwiches while other families went to expensive restaurants. But Louis was fast. Faster than boys with newer carts and professional coaches. Faster than boys whose parents could afford to travel to races in other countries. "That Hamilton boy has something special," Louis heard one father say to another. "Natural talent, you can't teach that." Louis wasn't sure what natural talent meant, but he knew it made his dad proud. Anthony would stand by the track fence with his hands gripped tight, watching every lap. When Louis won, Anthony's smile was so big it seemed to take up his whole face. At home, their small house began to fill with trophies. Shiny gold and silver cups that caught the light from the kitchen window. Anthony polished them every Sunday and arranged them on the mantelpiece like they were precious jewels. Louis's half-brother Nicholas was born when Louis was 9. Nicholas had cerebral palsy, which meant his muscles didn't work the same way as other people's. He needed help walking and talking and eating. Linda, Anthony's new wife, who had become Louis's stepmother, spent most of her time taking care of Nicholas. Doctor visits, physical therapy, special equipment. The house got quieter as everyone focused on helping Nicholas with basic things that came easily to Louis. Louis loved his little brother, but he also felt guilty about it. Guilty that he could run and jump and race, while Nicholas struggled to sit up straight. Guilty that his racing trophies took up space in a house where every penny was needed for Nicholas's care. Don't you worry about any of that, Anthony told him one night after a particularly expensive doctor visit. You keep racing. That's your job. You're gonna make it, son. I know you are. But Lewis did worry. He worried about the money his racing cost. He worried about Nicholas, who tried so hard to do simple things. He worried about his mom, Carmen, who seemed sadder every time he visited her. Carmen lived alone in a small flat with thin walls and a heating system that didn't work properly. She had a job at a local shop, but Lewis could tell it didn't make her happy. Sometimes when he visited, she would just stare out the window for long periods without talking. "Are you okay, Mom?" Lewis would ask. "I'm fine, baby," Carmen would say, but her smile never reached her eyes. "Tell me about your racing. Are you still winning?" Lewis would tell her about his latest race, about the other drivers, about the tracks they visited. Carmen would listen and nod, but Lewis could tell her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere dark that he couldn't reach. As Lewis got older, he began to understand that his family was different from other families. Not just because of the money, but because of the sadness that seemed to live in the corners of their lives. Nicholas needed constant care. Carmen struggled with feelings she couldn't explain. Anthony worked so hard he barely had time to sleep. And Lewis was the one who was supposed to make it all worthwhile. "You're our hope," Anthony told him after Lewis won his first major championship at age 10. "You're gonna have opportunities we never had. You're gonna make something of yourself." Lewis wanted to make his dad proud. He wanted to justify all the sacrifices, all the long hours, all the money spent on fuel and tires and entry fees. But sometimes, late at night in his small bedroom, Lewis felt the weight of being everyone's hope. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he let them down? What if all their sacrifices were for nothing? At the go-kart track, these worries disappeared. Behind the wheel, Lewis was confident and fearless. He could overtake other drivers in corners that seemed impossible. He could find speed where others found only danger. But away from the track, Lewis was just a boy trying to hold together a family that always seemed on the edge of falling apart. He didn't know it yet, but this feeling of responsibility, the need to protect the people he loved, the fear of letting them down, would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. At 10 years old, Lewis Hamilton was already learning that love came with weight, that caring about people meant worrying about them. That sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't fix everything that was broken. But he was also learning that he was fast. Faster than anyone expected. Fast enough, maybe, to race toward a future where all the sacrifices would finally make sense. If only he could keep everyone safe long enough to get there. Cornwall, England. August. The holiday to Cornwall was Anthony's idea. "We all need a break," he said, looking at the pile of bills on the kitchen table. "Just a few days by the sea. Family time." Lewis knew they couldn't really afford it. Anthony had been working extra shifts at the garage, and Linda had taken on weekend cleaning jobs to help pay for Nicholas's new wheelchair. But when Uncle David called and offered to share the cost of renting a cottage, Anthony couldn't say no. "The kids need this," David had said over the phone. "Emma's been asking about Lewis for months, and James could use some time away from London." Uncle David was Anthony's younger brother. He lived in London with his wife Patricia and their 2 children, Emma, who was 5, and James, who was 13 and always seemed angry about something. Lewis liked Uncle David, but he worried about him too. David worked in an office and wore expensive suits, but there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than Anthony. Patricia was always checking her phone and seemed nervous around the children. The cottage they rented was small but clean, with windows that looked out over the cliffs toward the ocean. Lewis had never seen water so blue or skies so wide. Even Nicholas seemed excited, clapping his hands when he saw the waves from his wheelchair. "It's beautiful," Linda said, unpacking their suitcases in the tiny bedroom Lewis would share with James. "We should do this more often." But Lewis could see the worry lines around her eyes. He knew she was thinking about the money they were spending, and the physical therapy appointments Nicholas was missing. Emma bounced around the cottage like a small tornado. She had blonde curls that caught the sunlight and a laugh that reminded Lewis of wind chimes. She followed Lewis everywhere, asking endless questions about his go-kart racing. "Do you go really, really fast?" she asked, tugging on his sleeve as they walked down to the beach on their first day. "Pretty fast," Lewis said, holding her hand as they navigated the rocky path. Faster than cars? Not yet, Lewis laughed. But maybe someday. Emma's eyes went wide. Will you teach me to drive fast cars? When you're older, Lewis promised. Much older. The first 3 days of the holiday were perfect. They built sandcastles and collected shells. Anthony taught Lewis and James how to skip stones across the waves. Patricia actually smiled, taking pictures of Emma chasing seagulls along the water's edge. Even James seemed to relax. At home in London, he was always in trouble. Fights at school, staying out too late, making Patricia cry with worry. But at the beach, he helped Nicholas build elaborate sand sculptures and patiently answered Emma's constant questions. Maybe we could move here, Emma announced on their third night as they all sat around the cottage's small dinner table eating fish and chips. Live by the sea forever. That would be nice, David said, but his smile looked forced. Lewis noticed that David and Patricia barely talked to each other, even during meals. On the fourth day, they decided to visit Newquay Beach. It was bigger than the small cove near their cottage, with golden sand and waves that looked perfect for swimming. The water's warmer here, Patricia said, reading from a guidebook. Better for the Kilder. They set up their blankets and umbrellas near the lifeguard station. Nicholas stayed in his wheelchair under an underowl with Linda, who read him stories from a picture book. Anthony and David sat in folding chairs, drinking beer and talking about work. Lewis and James played football on the sand while Emma collected shells in a bright red bucket. The sun was warm but not too hot, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of salt and seaweed. Can we go swimming now? Emma asked, after filling her bucket twice. Please? The water looks so nice. Patricia checked her watch. I suppose it's been long enough after lunch, but stay close to shore. Lewis and James were good swimmers. They had learned at the local pool in Stevenage, taking lessons while Nicholas had his physical therapy sessions. Emma had taken swimming lessons too, and for a 5-year-old, she was surprisingly confident in the water. I'll watch her, Lewis told Patricia. Make sure she doesn't go too deep. Patricia nodded, already distracted by something on her phone. Thank you, Lewis. You're such a good cousin. The 3 children ran toward the water together. James dove under the first wave he reached, coming up with his hair slicked back and a huge grin on his face. Lewis waded in more carefully, testing the temperature and feeling the pull of the current around his ankles. Emma squealed with delight as the waves washed over her feet. It's cold, she laughed. But good cold. They played in the shallow water for a while, jumping over small waves and splashing each other. Emma was fearless, running deeper into the water each time a wave retreated. Not too far, Em, Lewis called, but she was already waist-deep, reaching for a pretty shell that sparkled just beyond her grasp. Lewis wasn't sure exactly when things went wrong. One moment, Emma was laughing and reaching for the shell. The next moment, she was being pulled away from shore by a current Lewis couldn't see. Lewis! Emma's voice changed from laughter to panic in seconds. Lewis, help! Lewis looked toward shore. The adults were at least 50 meters away, too far to hear Emma's cries over the sound of the waves. James was underwater, diving for shells and completely unaware of what was happening. Emma was already 10 meters from where she had been standing, being pulled further out to sea. Her blonde head disappeared under a wave, then popped up again, but Lewis could see she was struggling. James! Lewis shouted, but his cousin was still underwater. There was no time to run for help, no time to get the adults' attention. Emma disappeared under another wave, and this time she didn't come up right away. Lewis dove toward her without thinking. He was 12 years old and a strong swimmer, but the current was stronger than anything he had experienced. It pulled at his legs and arms, trying to drag him away from shore too. Emma! He called, swimming hard against the current. Where are you? Her head popped up again, but she was even further out now. Her face was white with fear, and Lewis could tell she was swallowing water with each wave. I'm coming! Lewis shouted, swimming harder than he ever had in his life. It took him forever to reach her. Or maybe it only took seconds. Time felt strange and slow and fast all at once. When he finally got close enough to grab her, Emma was barely conscious. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, and she wasn't fighting the waves anymore. Lewis grabbed her under the arms and tried to swim back toward shore, but the current was too strong. Every meter he swam forward, the water pulled them 2 meters back out to sea. Help! Lewis screamed toward the beach, "Help us!" But the waves swallowed his voice. The adults looked like tiny figures in the distance. Even if they could hear him, Lewis realized they would never reach Emma in time. Lewis made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of trying to swim back to shore, he focused on keeping Emma's head above water. He held her tight against his chest and let the current carry them both further out to sea, knowing that lifeguards could reach them there, but hoping Emma could hold on long enough. "Stay with me, Em," he whispered in her ear. "Don't give up. I've got you." But Emma wasn't responding anymore. Her body was limp in his arms, and Lewis couldn't tell if she was breathing. It felt like hours before he heard the motor of the lifeguard's boat. In reality, it was probably only 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes changed everything. The lifeguards pulled them both into the boat. Emma was unconscious, her lips blue and her skin cold despite the warm sun. One lifeguard started giving her rescue breathing while the other radioed for an ambulance. "Is she going to be okay?" Lewis asked, his whole body shaking with cold and fear. "We're doing everything we can," the lifeguard said. But Lewis heard the worry in his voice. At the hospital, Lewis sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room, wrapped in a scratchy blanket that smelled like disinfectant. His clothes were still damp with seawater, and he couldn't stop shivering. David paced back and forth across the small room. Patricia sat in the corner, crying quietly into her hands. Anthony and Linda tried to comfort them, but Lewis could see the fear in their eyes too. James sat next to Lewis, his face pale with guilt. "I should have been watching," he kept saying. "I should have helped." But Lewis knew it wasn't James's fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except his own. He was the oldest. He had promised to watch Emma. He should have been faster, stronger, better. Through the open door of the waiting room, Lewis could hear doctors talking in low voices. Words like oxygen deprivation and brain damage and too long underwater drifted down the hallway like warnings. When Dr. Matthews finally came to talk to them, his face was serious but not hopeless. "Emma is alive," he said, and Patricia let out a sob of relief. "But she was underwater for several minutes. We won't know the full extent of any damage until she wakes up." "What kind of damage?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Matthews hesitated. "When the brain doesn't get oxygen, it can affect many things. Speech, movement, thinking. We just have to wait and see." Lewis felt something break inside his chest. A cold, heavy weight settled in his stomach and never went away. Emma woke up 2 days later, but she wasn't the same little girl who had collected shells in a red bucket. She couldn't speak clearly anymore. Her left side was weak, and she had trouble understanding simple questions. The Emma who had dreamed of learning to drive fast cars was gone. In her place was a child who would need help with everything for the rest of her life. Lewis sat by her hospital bed and held her hand. Emma looked at him with confused eyes, as if she couldn't quite remember who he was. "I'm sorry," Lewis whispered. "I'm so sorry." But Emma couldn't understand what he was saying. And Lewis realized that all the apologies in the world couldn't give her back what she had lost in those terrible minutes under the waves. As he watched his Uncle David cry silently in the hallway and his Aunt Patricia stare at Emma with empty eyes, Lewis made a promise to himself. He would never be responsible for someone's safety again. He would never put another person in danger because of his choices. He would never let himself love someone enough to fail them the way he had failed. Emma. Stevenage, England, September. Lewis came home from Cornwall different. Anthony noticed it first. His son moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and careful, as if he was afraid of breaking something just by being there. "It wasn't your fault," Anthony said, for the 100th time, as they loaded the go-kart into their van for the first race after the holiday. "You saved her life, Lewis. You're a hero." But Lewis just stared out the window and didn't answer. The word hero felt like a lie. Heroes didn't let little girls get hurt. Heroes were fast enough and strong enough to save people completely. At Larkswood Park, the familiar smell of fuel and rubber should have made Lewis feel better. This was his place, where everything made sense. But even here, surrounded by engines and speed, the weight in his chest wouldn't go away. "Ready to show them what you can do?" asked Pete Morrison, Lewis's mechanic. Pete was a kind man who had been working on go-karts longer than Lewis had been alive. Lewis nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He climbed into his cart and adjusted his helmet. The engine started with its usual cough and rumble, but the sound that used to excite him now just felt loud. The other drivers lined up for the race. Boys Lewis had known for years, who used to joke and laugh with him before races started. Now they seemed far away, like people he was watching through glass. When the green flag dropped, Lewis drove like never before. Not with joy or excitement, but with desperate focus. He overtook 3 drivers in the first corner, diving into gaps that barely existed. Other drivers honked their horns in protest, but Lewis didn't care. He needed to go fast. He needed to win. He needed to prove that he was good at something, even if he had failed at the most important thing. Lewis won the race by 8 seconds. It was his biggest victory margin ever. But when he climbed out of his cart, he felt empty instead of proud. "That was incredible," Pete said, checking the cart's engine. "You drove like a man possessed." That was exactly how Lewis felt. Possessed by something he couldn't control, something that made him take risks he never would have taken before. "Let's go home," Lewis said quietly. Anthony looked concerned. Usually after a win, Lewis wanted to stay and talk to other drivers, to celebrate and analyze every corner of the race. Now he just wanted to leave. On the drive home, Anthony tried to start conversations, but Lewis gave short answers and turned toward the window. The countryside passed by in a blur of green fields and gray sky. At home, Lewis went straight to his room. He sat on his bed and stared at the wall where his trophies used to be displayed. After Cornwall, he had asked Linda to put them away. Looking at them made him feel sick. Linda knocked on his door around dinner time. "Lewis, you need to eat something." "Not hungry," Lewis said. Linda came in anyway and sat on the edge of his bed. She looked tired. Taking care of Nicholas was hard work, and now she was worried about Lewis too. "Your dad is scared," she said gently. "We all are. You haven't been yourself since the holiday." Lewis wanted to tell her everything. How he heard Emma's laugh in his dreams. How he woke up every morning thinking about those terrible seconds when he couldn't reach her fast enough. How he felt like a fake every time someone called him a hero. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just shrugged. "Emma is getting better," Linda said. "Your Uncle David called yesterday. She's starting to walk again with help, and she can say a few words now." Lewis felt a stab of hope, followed immediately by guilt. Better wasn't the same as normal. Emma would never be the laughing, running, dreaming little girl she had been before. "That's good," Lewis said, but his voice sounded flat even to himself. Over the next few weeks, Lewis threw himself into racing with frightening intensity. He practiced for hours every day after school, working on his technique until his hands were raw from gripping the steering wheel. At races, he drove with an aggression that worried other parents. He took corners at impossible speeds and overtook other drivers in places that made spectators gasp. He won race after race but never celebrated. "You're gonna hurt yourself driving like that," warned Tom Bradley, whose son raced against Lewis. "This isn't Formula One. These are children's races." But Lewis couldn't drive any other way. When he was going fast, really fast, the guilt couldn't catch up with him. The weight in his chest got lighter. For a few minutes at a time, he could forget about Cornwall and Emma and the sound of her calling his name from the waves. Anthony was torn between pride and worry. His son was winning everything, dominating races against boys 2 years older. But Lewis never smiled anymore. He barely talked. He was becoming a stranger in his own family. "Maybe we should take a break from racing," Anthony suggested one evening after Lewis had won another championship. "Just for a while, until you feel better." Lewis looked at his father with panic in his eyes. Racing was the only thing that helped. The only time he felt in control. "No," Lewis said firmly. "I need to race." Anthony didn't understand, but he could see that racing was important to Lewis in a way it had never been before. So he kept taking him to tracks around England, watching his son drive with desperate skill. At school, Lewis's teachers noticed changes too. He had always been quiet, but now he barely spoke to other children. He sat alone at lunch and avoided playground games. Mrs. Whitfield, his teacher, called Anthony for a meeting. "Lewis seems withdrawn," she said, sitting across from Anthony in her small classroom. "His grades are fine, but he doesn't interact with the other children anymore." "Has something happened at home?" Anthony didn't know how to explain about Emma without breaking Lewis's privacy. "There was an accident during our holiday," he said carefully. A family member was hurt. Lewis blames himself, even though it wasn't his fault. Mrs. Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. She had seen children react to trauma in many different ways. Has he talked to anyone about it? A counselor, perhaps? Anthony shook his head. Lewis refused to talk about Cornwall with anyone. He just raced and went to school and helped with Nicholas, moving through each day like he was following a script. Sometimes children need time to process difficult experiences, Mrs. Whitfield said. But isolation isn't healthy. Maybe I could arrange for Lewis to help with some of the younger children. Sometimes helping others can help us heal. The next week, Mrs. Whitfield asked Lewis to help in the nursery class during his free period. The children were 4 and 5 years old, the same age Emma had been. Lewis felt his chest tighten as he walked into the bright classroom full of small chairs and colorful posters. The children looked up at him with curious eyes, and for a moment Lewis saw Emma in every face. "This is Lewis," Mrs. Whitfield told the children. "He's going to help us with our reading today." Lewis sat in a tiny chair while children gathered around him with picture books. A little girl with blonde curls climbed onto his lap, reminding him painfully of Emma. "Will you read to me?" she asked, holding up a book about animals. Lewis's hands shook as he opened the book. But he read the story aloud, doing different voices for the different animals. The children laughed and asked him to read it again. For 20 minutes, Lewis felt almost normal. The children didn't know about Cornwall, or Emma, or the weight he carried. They just saw a big boy who read funny stories and helped them sound out difficult words. But when the session ended and Lewis walked back to his regular classroom, the weight returned heavier than before. Being around young children made him think about all the ways they could be hurt, all the dangers they didn't see coming. That night, Lewis made a decision. He would keep racing, because racing was the only thing that helped. But he would never again put himself in a position where someone's safety depended on him. He wouldn't babysit his young cousins anymore. He wouldn't volunteer to help with school activities that involved small children. He would win races and make his family proud. But he would do it alone. Lewis started visiting Emma every Saturday. The drive to London took 2 hours each way, but Anthony never complained about the fuel costs. He could see that these visits were important to Lewis, even if he didn't understand why. Emma was living at home with David and Patricia, but she needed constant supervision. She could walk short distances with help, and she could say simple words, but she got confused easily and tired quickly. "Lewis," Emma would say when she saw him, her face lighting up with recognition. It was one of the few words she could say clearly. Lewis would sit with her for hours, reading picture books and helping her with simple puzzles. Emma couldn't understand complex stories anymore, but she loved looking at colorful pictures and hearing Lewis's voice. Patricia always thanked Lewis for coming, but her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. David had started working longer hours, and Lewis suspected it was to avoid being at home. James had started getting into serious trouble at school, fighting with other students and refusing to do homework. "She loves you so much," Patricia told Lewis one Saturday, as he was getting ready to leave. "You're one of the few people she really remembers from before." Lewis felt the familiar stab of guilt. Emma remembered him because he was the one who had been there when everything went wrong. He was part of her last clear memory before her life changed forever. During the drive home, Anthony would try to talk to Lewis about the visits. "You know it's not your fault, don't you?" Anthony would say. "What happened to Emma?" Lewis would nod, but he didn't believe it. If he had been faster, stronger, better prepared, Emma would still be the laughing girl who wanted to learn to drive race cars. Instead, she was trapped in a damaged mind and body, and Lewis was the one who had failed to prevent it. By his 13th birthday, Lewis had won every major karting championship in his age group. Scouts from professional racing teams had started to notice him. His name appeared in racing magazines, and other drivers looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. But success felt hollow. Each trophy was just another reminder that he could excel at controlling machines while failing completely at protecting people. Lewis kept racing because it was the only escape from his guilt. He kept visiting Emma because she was the only person who made him feel useful. And he kept his promise to himself never to be responsible for someone's safety again. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would shape every relationship he had for the rest of his life. The boy who had once dreamed of having a family was already building walls that would take decades to tear down. At 13, Lewis Hamilton was one of the fastest young drivers in Europe. He was also one of the loneliest children in England, carrying a weight no child should bear. But he would keep carrying it, because he believed that was the price of failing someone you love. Various racing circuits. Europe. At 16, Lewis Hamilton was the most promising young driver in British motorsport. He had moved up from go-karts to Formula Renault, racing against grown men on famous circuits across Europe. His talent was undeniable, but his personality puzzled everyone who met him. "He's fast, no question," said team manager Brian Collins, watching Lewis practice at Silverstone. "But he's like a machine himself. No emotions, no friendships with other drivers, just pure focus." Lewis liked it that way. Emotions were dangerous. Friendships meant caring about people, and caring about people meant you could hurt them or let them down. Better to keep everyone at a distance. In the team garage, Lewis worked with his mechanics, but never joked around like other drivers. He learned everything he could about the car's setup, studying data sheets late into the night while other drivers went to dinner together. "Want to come grab some food with us?" asked teammate Marcus Webb after a long day of practice at Brands Hatch. "Thanks, but I'm busy," Lewis said, not looking up from his laptop screen full of tire temperature data. Marcus shrugged and left with the other drivers. Lewis heard them laughing in the hallway, and for a moment he felt a stab of loneliness. But loneliness was safer than letting people get close. Lewis's success on the track was bringing attention from bigger racing teams. Ron Dennis from McLaren had started watching Lewis's races, taking notes in his expensive suit and serious expression. But with success came pressure, and with pressure came the return of Lewis's old fears. Before races at coastal circuits like Monaco or Valencia, Lewis would wake up in cold sweats, his heart pounding. The sound of waves on the shore brought back memories of Emma's voice calling for help. Anthony noticed his son's strange behavior around water. "He used to love swimming," he said during a race weekend in Monaco. "Now you won't even walk near the harbor." Lewis made excuses about being focused on the race. But the truth was that large bodies of water made him panic. The Mediterranean Sea outside his hotel window looked beautiful to tourists. But to Lewis, it looked like danger. "I need to see someone," Lewis finally told his father after a particularly bad night where he couldn't sleep at all. "A doctor or something? My head's not right." Anthony was relieved. He had been worried about Lewis for years, but didn't know how to help. They found Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a therapist in London who specialized in working with athletes. Dr. Morgan's office was calm and quiet, with soft chairs and walls lined with psychology books. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice that reminded Lewis of Mrs. Whitfield from school. "Tell me about your racing," she said during their first session. "When did you start? What do you love about it?" Lewis found it easy to talk about technical things, car setup, racing lines, strategy. But when Dr. Morgan asked about his feelings or relationships, he shut down. "I don't really have close friends," Lewis admitted. "I focus on racing. That must be lonely sometimes." Dr. Morgan said. Lewis shrugged. "Lonely is safe." Dr. Morgan made notes in her notebook, but she didn't push. She seemed to understand that Lewis would need time to trust her. Over several months of sessions, Lewis slowly began to open up. He told Dr. Morgan about the pressure he felt to succeed, about the money his family had spent on his racing, about his fear of disappointing people. But he never mentioned Emma. That secret was too big, too painful to share with anyone. "You seem to carry a lot of guilt," Dr. Morgan observed during one session. "Guilt about things that aren't your responsibility." Lewis felt his chest tighten. "Like what?" "Like feeling responsible for your family's financial sacrifices. Like thinking you have to be perfect to justify their belief in you." Dr. Morgan was close to the truth, but not close enough. Lewis nodded and let her think that was the whole story. The therapy helped with some things. Lewis learned breathing techniques to manage his anxiety before races. He practiced talking to teammates and journalists without seeming completely antisocial. But the deepest wound, the guilt about Emma, remained untouched. During this time, Lewis met Maria Santos. She was a physiotherapist who worked with the racing team, helping drivers recover from injuries and stay in peak physical condition. Maria was different from anyone Lewis had met. She was Portuguese, with dark hair and laughing eyes, and she treated Lewis like a normal person instead of a racing prodigy. "Your shoulder is tight," she said during their first session, working on a muscle Lewis had strained during a crash. "Too much stress. You need to relax more." "I don't really do relaxing," Lewis said. Maria laughed. "Everyone needs to relax. Even racing drivers. Especially racing drivers." Lewis found himself looking forward to his sessions with Maria. She was easy to talk to, and she didn't seem impressed by his trophies or newspaper articles. She just saw him as Lewis, not Lewis Hamilton, the racing star. "What do you do when you're not racing?" Maria asked one day as she worked on his back muscles. "Study data. Work out. Practice on simulators." Lewis said. "That's still racing," Maria pointed out. "What do you do for fun?" Lewis realized he didn't have an answer. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something just because it was enjoyable. "I used to like swimming," he said quietly. "But not anymore." "Why not?" Lewis felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "Something happened when I was younger. Now water makes me nervous." Maria didn't push for details, but she made a suggestion that surprised Lewis. "I volunteer at a clinic for disabled children," she said. "They have a pool with special equipment. Very safe, very calm. Maybe being around water in a positive way could help." Lewis's first instinct was to say no. Being around disabled children would remind him too much of Emma, but something in Maria's voice made him curious. "What kind of work do you do there?" he asked. "Physical therapy, mostly. Helping kids get stronger, more mobile. Some of them have been in accidents. Some were born with disabilities. But they're all fighters." Lewis thought about Emma, who struggled every day with simple tasks that most people took for granted. Maybe understanding more about disability could help him understand what she was going through. "I could come with you sometime," Lewis said. "Just to see." The clinic was in a converted community center in South London. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of specialized equipment and cheerful staff members. Lewis felt nervous as Maria led him through the building. "This is Lewis," Maria told the children in the pool area. "He's going to help us today." The children ranged in age from 5 to 15. Some were in wheelchairs, some used walking frames, some had cognitive disabilities that made them seem younger than their years. Lewis felt his chest tighten as he thought about Emma. But these children were different from Emma in one important way. They were laughing. "Can you help me with my floating?" asked a girl named Sophie, who was about 10 years old. She had spina bifida and couldn't use her legs normally, but her smile was huge. Lewis looked at Maria uncertainly. "I don't know if I should." "Just hold her steady while she practices," Maria said. "You'll be fine." Lewis got into the warm water carefully. His heart was beating fast, but the pool was small and shallow, not like the ocean at Cornwall. Sophie was brave and determined, working hard to improve her floating technique. "You're good at this," Lewis told her after she managed to float for 30 seconds. "My dream is to swim in the Paralympics," Sophie said. "Maria says if I keep working hard, maybe I can do it someday." Lewis spent 2 hours at the clinic that day. He helped children with their exercises, read books to younger kids who were resting between therapy sessions, and even played adapted games of football with children who used wheelchairs. When it was time to leave, Lewis felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he had helped someone without anything going wrong. "Thank you for coming," Maria said as they walked to the car park. "The children loved having you here." "Can I come back?" Lewis asked. "Next week, maybe?" Maria smiled. "Of course. But why do you want to? Most people find it difficult, seeing children with disabilities." Lewis thought about how to answer. He couldn't tell Maria about Emma, but he could tell part of the truth. "I think they're braver than I am," he said. "They don't let fear stop them from trying." Over the next few months, Lewis became a regular volunteer at the clinic. The children adored him, and the staff was amazed by his patience and gentleness. But more importantly, Lewis began to see disability differently. These children weren't defined by what they couldn't do. They were defined by their determination, their joy, their refusal to give up. Maybe Emma wasn't as broken as he had thought. Maybe her life still had value and meaning, even if it was different from what it had been before. Lewis and Maria grew closer through their work at the clinic. She was the first person in years who made Lewis want to open up, to share his thoughts and feelings. One evening, after a particularly good day at the clinic, Lewis found himself sitting in Maria's small flat drinking tea and talking about the children they had worked with. "There's something I need to tell you," Lewis said suddenly. "About why I stopped swimming. About why I'm the way I am." Maria set down her teacup and waited. Lewis took a deep breath and told her about Emma, about the holiday in Cornwall, about the accident, about the guilt he had carried for 6 years. He told her about Emma's brain damage, about his family falling apart, about his promise never to be responsible for someone's safety again. "I can't have children," Lewis finished. "What if I can't protect them? What if I make the wrong choice again?" Maria was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Lewis, you were 12 years old. You saved her life." "I was too slow," Lewis said. "If I had been faster, if you hadn't been there at all, she would have died," Maria interrupted. "You gave her a chance to live. That's not failure, that's courage." Lewis wanted to believe her, but the guilt was too deep, too much a part of who he was. "I see Emma every week," he said. "She's not the same person she was before. She'll never have a normal life." "What's normal?" Maria asked. "The children at the clinic aren't normal either. But they're happy. They have friends, families who love them, dreams for the future. Life doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable." For a moment, Lewis felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe he had been looking at Emma's accident the wrong way. But then he thought about the risk of having his own children. What if something happened to them? What if his choices put them in danger? "I can't risk it," Lewis said. "I can't take the chance of hurting someone I love again." Maria tried to argue, but Lewis had made up his mind. Over the next few weeks, their relationship began to change. Maria wanted children someday, and Lewis couldn't give them to her. "You're punishing yourself for having a good heart," Maria told him during their last conversation as a couple. "You care so much about not hurting people that you won't let yourself love them." Lewis knew she was right, but knowledge didn't change his fear. When Maria finally gave up trying to convince him, Lewis felt both relief and devastating loss. He had found someone who could love him despite his walls, and he had pushed her away to protect her from his failures. It was exactly what he had promised himself he would do, but it hurt more than he had expected. Lewis threw himself back into racing with renewed intensity. He won championship after championship, but success felt empty without anyone to share it with. At night, alone in hotel rooms around Europe, Lewis would think about Maria and the children at the clinic. He would think about Emma, still struggling with basic tasks at 19 years old. He would think about the family he would never have because he was too afraid to trust himself with anyone's happiness. But fear was stronger than loneliness. Fear was safer than love. And Lewis had learned that the price of loving someone was sometimes too high to pay. McLaren Technology Center. Woking January. The phone call that changed Lewis Hamilton's life came on a gray Tuesday morning. Ron Dennis, the boss McLaren Formula One team, spoke in his usual calm, measured voice. "Lewis, we'd like you to drive for us this season. You'll be teammates with Fernando Alonso, the world champion. Are you ready?" Lewis was 22 years old. He had dreamed of this moment since he was 8, sitting in his father's kitchen in Stevenage. But instead of pure joy, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Yes, sir," Lewis said. "I'm ready." But as he hung up the phone, Lewis wondered if anyone was ever really ready to have their entire life change overnight. The McLaren factory was like something from a science fiction movie. Everything was white and silver and spotlessly clean. Engineers in matching uniforms worked on cars that cost millions of pounds to build. Lewis walked through the building with his father Anthony, both of them trying not to look too amazed. This was the biggest moment of their lives, the payoff for 20 years of sacrifice and hard work. "You belong here," Anthony whispered as they met with team officials. "Remember that. You've earned this." Lewis nodded, but inside he felt like an imposter. The other drivers had grown up wealthy, with private schools and professional coaches. Lewis had grown up in Stevenage, with a father who worked 3 jobs and a go-kart held together with duct tape. "The media will be interested in your story," warned team publicist Sarah Mitchell during Lewis's first briefing. "Poor kid from Council Estate makes it to Formula One. They'll want to know everything about your background." Lewis felt his chest tighten. The media could know about his humble beginnings, his father's sacrifices, his rapid rise through the racing categories. But they could never know about Emma. That secret would stay buried. Lewis's first Formula One race was in Australia. The Melbourne circuit was beautiful, with tree-lined corners and grandstands packed with enthusiastic fans. But as Lewis sat in his silver McLaren on the starting grid, all he could think about was not making a mistake. "Just drive like you know how," his race engineer Phil Prue said over the radio. "You've got the speed. Trust yourself." But trusting himself was exactly what Lewis couldn't do. What if he crashed and hurt another driver? What if his decisions on track led to someone getting injured? Lewis drove the race like he was carrying precious cargo. He was fast but careful, aggressive but not reckless. He finished third, standing on the podium in his first ever Formula One race. The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, and champagne sprayed everywhere. Lewis smiled and waved, playing the part of the happy rookie, but inside he felt hollow. "How does it feel to be on the podium in your first race?" asked a journalist after the ceremony. "Amazing," Lewis said, giving the answer everyone expected. "A dream come true." It was partly true. But dreams were supposed to feel better than this. Lewis's early success in Formula One was extraordinary. He won his first race in Canada, fought wheel-to-wheel with world champions, and nearly won the championship in his rookie season. The media called him a sensation, a natural, a future superstar. But success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions Lewis didn't want to answer. "Do you have a girlfriend?" asked a reporter from a tabloid newspaper. "Any plans to settle down and start a family?" Lewis had prepared answers for these questions. "I'm focused on my career right now. Racing is my priority." The reporter pressed further. "But surely a successful young man like you must have someone special." Lewis gave his practice smile. "When the right person comes along, you'll be the first to know." It was easier to let people think he was too busy or too picky than to explain the real reason he kept relationships shallow. The media created an image of Lewis as a playboy, dating models and celebrities but never getting serious with anyone. Lewis didn't mind the image. It protected his privacy and kept people from asking deeper questions. But the reality was much lonelier than the headlines suggested. Lewis moved to Monaco, the tiny country where many Formula One drivers lived. His apartment overlooked the harbor where he had sat with Marcus Chen years later. But in 2007, he was too busy to appreciate the view. The apartment was beautiful, but empty. Expensive furniture that looked good in magazines, but didn't feel like home. Lewis would come back from races around the world and sit alone in his pristine living room, wondering why success felt so isolating. His phone would ring with invitations to parties and events. Beautiful women wanted to meet the famous racing driver. Other celebrities wanted to be photographed with him. Lewis went to some of these events, playing the part people expected. He smiled for cameras and made small talk about racing and travel and expensive watches. But he always left early, always went home alone. "You could have anyone you want," his friend and trainer Angela Cullen told him after yet another event where Lewis had politely declined several invitations for dates. "That's the problem," Lewis said quietly. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Angela didn't understand what he meant, and Lewis didn't explain. The 2007 season ended with Lewis losing the championship by 1 point to Kimi Raikkonen. The Finnish driver was calm and professional, shaking Lewis's hand after the final race in Brazil. "Good season," Kimi said in his typical understated way. "You'll win it next year." Lewis hoped he was right, but the loss stung more than he expected. All those sacrifices, all that pressure, and he had come so close only to fall short. During the off-season, Lewis started having the dreams again. Not every night, but often enough to disrupt his sleep. Always the same. Emma calling for help from dark water, while Lewis swam toward her but never got closer. He would wake up in his expensive Monaco apartment, heart pounding and sheets soaked with sweat. The sound of waves against the harbor outside his window would make him feel sick. Lewis tried to distract himself with training and preparation for the 2008 season. He worked out until his muscles ached, studied video footage until his eyes burned, practiced on simulators until he could drive every corner of every track blindfolded. But the loneliness was getting harder to ignore. Success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. Lewis started dating Nicole Scherzinger, the American singer. She was beautiful, talented, and kind. The media loved their relationship, calling them a perfect couple. Nicole was different from the other women Lewis had dated. She was intelligent and ambitious, with her own successful career. She didn't need Lewis's money or fame. "I like that you're not like other racing drivers," Nicole told him during one of their early dates. "You're thoughtful, sensitive. You care about things that matter." Lewis wanted to tell her why he was different, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that his sensitivity came from guilt? That his thoughtfulness was really just fear of making another terrible mistake? Their relationship was conducted in the public eye. Photographers followed them to restaurants and events. Fans analyzed their every interaction on social media. Lewis enjoyed Nicole's company, but he kept part of himself locked away. Even with her, he couldn't fully relax or trust completely. The 2008 season was a roller coaster of emotions. Lewis won several races but also made costly mistakes. With 5 races remaining, he was trailing Felipe Massa in the championship standings. "You need to be more aggressive," his teammate Fernando Alonso advised. "Take more risks. Sometimes you drive like you're afraid." Fernando was right, but not in the way he thought. Lewis wasn't afraid of crashing or ooling. He was afraid of hurting someone else through his decisions. The Brazilian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. Lewis needed to finish 5th or better to win his first world championship. The weather was terrible, with heavy rain making the track treacherous. As Lewis sat on the starting grid, water streaming down his helmet visor, he thought about Emma, about the water that had changed both their lives, about fear and courage, and the difference between the two. "This is it," Phil Proust said over the radio. "Drive like the champion you are." Lewis took a deep breath and made a decision. For the next 2 hours, he would stop being afraid. He would drive with the fearless joy he had felt as a child, before he learned that loving people meant you could lose them. The race was chaos. Cars spun off the track, safety cars controlled the speed, and championship positions changed lap by lap. But Lewis drove with complete focus, managing risks while pushing for every advantage. In the final corners of the final lap, Lewis passed Timo Glock to secure the position he needed. He had won his first world championship by just 1 point. As Lewis crossed the finish line, his radio crackled with celebration from his team. Anthony was crying in the McLaren garage. The British media was calling it one of the greatest comebacks in racing history. But Lewis felt strangely calm. He had achieved his childhood dream, proven himself against the best drivers in the world, and made his family proud. Yet as he climbed out of his car in the chaos of the Brazilian paddock, Lewis realized that winning felt exactly like he had expected. Amazing and empty at the same time. He had reached the top of his sport, but he was still carrying the same weight he had carried since he was 12 years old. The championship trophy was beautiful, but it couldn't fill the hole in his heart where a normal life should have been. That night, Lewis called Emma from his hotel room in São Paulo. She was 26 now, still living with her parents, still struggling with the effects of her brain injury. "Lewis," Emma said when she heard his voice. Her speech was clearer now after years of therapy, but still slow and careful. "I won the championship," Lewis said. "I'm the world champion." "That's good," Emma said, though Lewis wasn't sure she fully understood what it meant. "I'm proud of you." Lewis felt tears in his eyes. "I wish you could have been there. I was watching on TV," Emma said. "You looked happy." Lewis had looked happy on television because that was his job. But sitting alone in a Brazilian hotel room, talking to the cousin whose life he had failed to save completely, Lewis felt the familiar weight of everything he had achieved and everything he had given up to achieve it. He was a world champion, but he was also a man who was too afraid to love anyone completely. And Lewis wasn't sure which fact made him sadder. Monaco. The mask Lewis Hamilton wore got heavier each year. In public, he was the confident world champion, the fashion-forward celebrity, the racing driver who dated pop stars and attended exclusive parties. In private, he was a man slowly drowning in his own success. The McLaren car that had won him the 2008 championship became uncompetitive. Lewis watched other drivers win races he should have won, stood on podiums where he belonged on the top step, and smiled for cameras while his heart broke a little more each time. "These things happen in Formula One," his father Anthony said after another disappointing race weekend. "The car will get better." But Lewis wasn't sure he would get better. Each failure on track felt like proof that he didn't deserve his success. Each mistake reminded him of the mistake he had made at 12 years old. During the difficult seasons, Lewis threw himself into other activities. He moved to Los Angeles for part of the year, exploring music and fashion and celebrity culture. The media followed his every move, creating stories about his lifestyle and relationships. Lewis Hamilton parties while his racing suffers, read one headline. Has success gone to his head? Lewis read the articles and felt nothing. Let them think he was distracted by fame. It was easier than explaining that he was distracted by guilt. His relationship with Nicole Scherzinger became the subject of constant speculation. They were photographed together at events, walking on beaches, attending award shows. The pictures showed a glamorous couple living a perfect life. The reality was more complicated. We need to talk, Nicole said one evening in her Los Angeles apartment. She had just returned from a tour, and Lewis could see the exhaustion in her eyes. About what? Lewis asked, though he knew what was coming. About us. About where this is going. Nicole sat across from him on her expensive sofa, still beautiful after months of performing around the world. I'm 34, Lewis. I want to get married. I want children. Lewis felt his chest tighten. They had been together on and off for 3 years. Long enough for Nicole to want something more serious. Long enough for Lewis to know he couldn't give it to her. I'm not ready for that, Lewis said quietly. When will you be ready? When you're 40, 50. Nicole's voice was frustrated but not angry. She genuinely wanted to understand. You're successful. You're young. You have everything. What are you waiting for? Lewis wanted to tell her about Emma. About the fear that lived in his chest like a cold weight. About the nightmares that still woke him up sweating. About the promise he had made to himself never to be responsible for someone's safety again. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. I just need more time, Lewis said, knowing it was a lie. Nicole studied his face with the careful attention she gave to learning new songs. It's not about time, is it? There's something you're not telling me. Lewis stood up and walked to the window. Los Angeles spread out below them. Millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, families were having dinner together, tucking children into bed, planning futures they believed in. I can't explain it, Lewis said finally, but I can't give you what you want. Nicole was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was sad but resigned. I love you, Lewis, but I can't wait forever for you to decide I'm worth the risk. They broke up that night, though they would get back together and break up several more times over the next 2 years. Each reunion felt desperate. Each separation felt inevitable. Lewis started seeing Dr. James Murphy, a sports psychologist who worked with several Formula One drivers. Dr. Murphy was different from Dr. Morgan. Older, more direct, focused on performance rather than emotions. Your driving has become too careful, Dr. Murphy observed after watching videos of Lewis's recent races. You're not taking the risks that made you champion. Maybe careful is better, Lewis said. Maybe I was too reckless before. Reckless? You? You're one of the most calculating drivers I've ever studied. Dr. Murphy looked genuinely puzzled. When did you become afraid of pushing the limits? Lewis couldn't answer that question without revealing too much. He deflected, talking about car performance and team strategy instead of the real issue. But Dr. Murphy was persistent. Over several sessions, he helped Lewis understand that his overcautious driving style was connected to deeper fears. Something happened to you when you were young, Dr. Murphy said during one session. Something that made you afraid of your own judgment. Lewis felt exposed, like Dr. Murphy could see right through him. But he still couldn't talk about Emma. That secret was too big, too painful, too central to who he had become. The 2011 season was Lewis's worst year as a professional driver. He made mistakes that cost him races, got involved in accidents with other drivers, and earned criticism from racing experts who had once praised him. Lewis Hamilton is driving like a man with something to prove, wrote one journalist. But he's proving all the wrong things. The criticism hurt because it was partly true. Lewis was angry. At his car, at his team, at himself, for not being able to perform the way he knew he could. But underneath the anger was the familiar weight of guilt and fear. During the Monaco Grand Prix, Lewis crashed while trying to overtake another driver in an impossible position. It was exactly the kind of reckless move he usually avoided, and it reminded everyone watching why he had been so careful before. As Lewis climbed out of his damaged car, he felt something break inside himself. Not physically, but emotionally. He was tired of being careful and tired of being reckless. He was tired of being afraid, and tired of pretending he wasn't afraid. Most of all, he was tired of carrying his secret alone. That weekend, Louis walked through the streets of Monaco until he found himself at the Children's Hospital. It was the same hospital where he had met Lucas, the young boy who reminded him of Emma. "Can I visit the patients?" Louis asked at the reception desk. The nurse recognized him immediately. "Of course, Mr. Hamilton. The children would love to see you." How Louis spent 3 hours at the hospital that day. He read stories to young patients, signed autographs for teenagers who were racing fans, and played simple games with children who were too sick to leave their beds. One boy, about 8 years old, was recovering from a serious car accident. His legs were in casts, and his face was still bruised from his injuries. "Will I be able to walk normally again?" the boy asked. Louis looked into the child's worried eyes and saw Emma at 5 years old, asking similar questions after her accident. He saw himself at 12, desperate to give reassuring answers he didn't have. "The doctors will do everything they can," Louis said carefully. "And you're strong. I can tell." "My mom says I'm lucky to be alive," the boy said. "A man pulled me out of the car after the crash. I don't remember it, but she says he was a hero." Louis felt something shift in his chest. This boy had been saved by someone's quick thinking and courage. Someone who had acted without hesitation when a life was in danger, just like Louis had acted when Emma was drowning. "That man was brave," Louis said quietly. "You should be grateful he was there." "I am," the boy said. "Mum says he didn't hesitate. He just did what needed to be done." Louis left the hospital that day with his mind spinning. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to think about Emma's accident from a different angle. What if he hadn't been too slow? What if he had been exactly fast enough? What if Emma's survival, even with her disabilities, was something to be grateful for rather than something to feel guilty about? The thought was too big and too scary to hold on to for long. But it planted a seed that would grow slowly over the coming years. Louis's relationship with Nicole finally ended for good in 2012. They had tried to make it work, but Louis's inability to commit to a future together made it impossible. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," Nicole said during their final conversation. "Because you're running out of time to find it." Louis knew she was right. He was 27 years old, successful beyond his wildest dreams, but emotionally stuck at 12 years old on a beach in Cornwall. He started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Rebecca Hayes, who specialized in trauma recovery. She was younger than his previous therapists, with a direct approach that reminded Louis of the racing engineers he worked with. "You carry yourself like someone who's done something terrible," Dr. Hayes observed during their first session. "But nothing in your public record suggests that's true." "People don't know everything about me," Louis said. "What don't they know?" Louis felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the wall that went up whenever someone got too close to his secret. But Dr. Hayes waited patiently, and Louis found himself wanting to trust her. "When I was 12, Louis began, and then stopped. The words were right there, but saying them felt like jumping off a cliff. Dr. Hayes nodded encouragingly. "When you were 12, something happened. My cousin almost drowned," Louis said quickly, before he could change his mind. "I tried to save her, but I wasn't fast enough. She has brain damage now, because of me." Dr. Hayes listened without judgment as Louis told her the whole story. About Emma, about Cornwall, about the guilt that had shaped every decision he had made since that day. When Louis finished talking, Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Louis," she said finally, "you saved her life." "I was too slow," Louis protested. She has brain damage because of an accident." Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. "She's alive because of your courage." Those are two different things. Louis wanted to argue, but something in Dr. Hayes' voice made him pause. For the first time in 15 years, someone was suggesting that maybe he wasn't the villain in Emma's story. Maybe he was the hero after all. But changing a belief he had held for so long would take more than one conversation. It would take time, patience, and the kind of courage Louis wasn't sure he still possessed. The seed of doubt, or hope, that had been planted at the Children's Hospital began to grow a little bit bigger. Mercedes-AMG Petronas factory, Brackley, September. The decision to leave McLaren felt like jumping off a bridge. Louis sat in Toto Wolff's office, staring at the contract that would change his career forever. Mercedes was promising him a competitive car, a fresh start and the chance to prove himself all over again. This is a big risk for both of us, Toto said honestly. His Austrian accent made everything sound serious and thoughtful. Mercedes hasn't won a championship in decades, but we believe we can build something special. Lewis picked up the pen. He had spent 6 years at McLaren, winning 1 championship and losing several others. The team felt like family, but sometimes you had to leave family to find yourself. I'm ready for something new, Lewis said, signing his name with a flourish. But even as he wrote his signature, Lewis felt the familiar weight of responsibility. What if Mercedes couldn't deliver on their promises? What if he had made the wrong choice again? The move to Mercedes was controversial. Racing experts questioned Lewis's judgment. Former teammates suggested he was making a mistake. The media portrayed him as a driver chasing money rather than success. Lewis read the criticism and tried not to care. He had learned that other people's opinions couldn't hurt him as much as his own thoughts. The first time Lewis drove the Mercedes W05 car in 2014, he knew he had made the right decision. The hybrid engine was powerful but complex, requiring drivers to manage electrical energy as well as traditional fuel. It was like learning to race all over again. This car is different, Lewis told his new race engineer Pete Bonington during testing. More technical, more sophisticated. You'll figure it out, Pete said with calm confidence. You always do. Pete was unlike any engineer Lewis had worked with before. He was steady where others were excitable, patient where others were demanding. Working with Pete felt like having a reliable older brother. Lewis won his first race for Mercedes in Malaysia. As he crossed the finish line, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pure joy in driving. Not the desperate need to prove himself, not the fear of making mistakes, just the simple pleasure of being faster than everyone else. That's how you do it. Pete's voice crackled over the radio. Perfect drive, mate. Lewis pumped his fist in the air as he drove the cool-down lap. For a few minutes, he felt like the 8-year-old boy who had fallen in love with go-karts before guilt and fear had complicated everything. The 2014 season became a battle between Lewis and his teammate Nico Rosberg. Nico was German, precise, and politically smart. He had grown up in Monaco and spoke 4 languages fluently. Everything about him was the opposite of Lewis's working-class background. Their rivalry was intense, but professional at first. They pushed each other to drive faster, to find advantages in car setup and strategy. Lewis thrived on the competition, using it to distract himself from the loneliness that still haunted his personal life. But as the season progressed and Lewis started winning more races, their relationship became strained. Nico was desperate to beat the driver everyone said was naturally faster. Lewis was desperate to prove that moving to Mercedes had been worth the risk. During this time, Lewis started working more intensively with Dr. Rebecca Hayes. Their sessions became the most honest conversations Lewis had ever had with another person. You use racing to avoid dealing with your emotions, Dr. Hayes observed. When you're driving, you don't have to think about Emma or relationships or the future. Racing is my job, Lewis protested. It's what I'm good at. It's also your hiding place, Dr. Hayes said gently. But you can't drive forever. What happens when you retire? What happens when you're forced to face the parts of your life you've been avoiding? Lewis didn't have an answer. Retirement felt impossible to imagine. Racing was the only thing that made him feel valuable, the only place where his perfectionism was an asset rather than a burden. Tell me about your visits with Emma, Dr. Hayes said during one session. How is she doing now? Lewis's weekly visits to see Emma had continued for 17 years. She was 22 now, living in a supported housing facility that specialized in caring for adults with brain injuries. She's doing well, Lewis said. She can't live independently, but she's happy. She has friends, activities she enjoys. The staff loves her. How does that make you feel? Lewis thought about it. Guilty. She should be living her own life, not needing help with everything. But she is living her own life, Dr. Hayes pointed out. It's different from the life she might have had, but it's still her life. She's making choices, forming relationships, experiencing joy. Why isn't that enough? Lewis felt uncomfortable with the question. He had spent so many years focusing on what Emma had lost that he had never really considered what she had gained. I suppose I never thought about it that way, Lewis admitted. Maybe it's time to start, Dr. Hayes suggested. Lewis won his second world championship in 2014, beating Nico in the final race of the season. The victory felt different from his first championship. Less desperate, more earned. He had proved that leaving McLaren was the right decision. But personal success still felt hollow when he had no one to share it with. Lewis attended the championship celebration party alone, surrounded by team members and journalists, but feeling isolated in the crowd. "You should be happier," observed Susie Wolff, Toto's wife and a racing driver herself. "You just became world champion again." "I am happy," Lewis said, but his smile felt forced. Susie studied his face with the directness of someone used to reading people quickly.
No, you're not. You're successful, but you're not happy. There's a difference.
Lewis was beginning to understand that difference. Success was external. Trophies, money, recognition. Happiness was internal, contentment. Peace, the ability to enjoy what you had achieved. Lewis had plenty of success. Happiness remained elusive. During the off-season, Lewis traveled to Africa for the first time. He visited Ghana, connecting with his heritage and learning about his family's history before they came to England. The trip was meant to be a vacation, but it became something deeper. In Accra, Lewis visited a school for disabled children. The facility was basic compared to the clinics he knew in England, but the children's spirits were the same, determined, joyful, refusing to be defined by their limitations. "You are very tall," said a young girl named Akasua, who used a wheelchair due to spina bifida. "Are you a basketball player?" "I'm a racing driver," Lewis said, kneeling to be at her eye level. "That sounds fun. I would like to drive fast cars someday." Lewis felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Admiration for this girl's optimism in the face of significant challenges. "Maybe you will," Lewis said. "There are special racing cars for people who use wheelchairs." Akasua's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? Can you show me?" Lewis spent the afternoon telling Akasua and the other children about adaptive racing programs, about athletes who had succeeded despite disabilities, about the importance of never giving up on dreams just because they seemed impossible. As he left the school, Lewis realized something important. These children didn't see their disabilities as tragedies. They saw them as challenges to overcome, problems to solve, facts of life to work around. Maybe Emma saw her situation the same way. Maybe Lewis was the only one who still thought of her accident as a catastrophe. Back in Monaco, Lewis called Emma from his apartment. It was their usual Saturday conversation, but this time Lewis asked different questions. "Are you happy, Em?" Lewis asked directly. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the careful thought she gave to everything since her accident. "Yes," she said finally. "I have friends here. I help in the garden. I like painting now. I'm happy. Even though things are harder for you than other people, everyone has hard things," Emma said with simple wisdom. "Mine are just different." Lewis felt something shift in his chest. For 17 years he had been carrying guilt about ruining Emma's life. But Emma didn't think her life was ruined. She thought it was just different. "I'm glad you're happy," Lewis said, and for the first time he meant it completely. "Are you happy, Lewis?" Emma asked. "You sound sad sometimes when we talk." The question caught Lewis off guard. Emma rarely asked about his feelings, partly because her brain injury made it difficult to process complex emotional concepts. But sometimes she surprised him with unexpected insight. "I'm working on being happy," Lewis said honestly. "It's harder than racing," Emma laughed, a sound that reminded Lewis of wind chimes in the garden. "Everything is harder than racing for you. You're very good at racing." Lewis smiled despite himself. "What else am I good at?" "Being kind," Emma said immediately. "Taking care of people, making me feel better when I'm sad." Lewis felt tears in his eyes. He had spent 17 years thinking of himself as the person who had failed Emma. She thought of him as the person who took care of her. Maybe they were both right. Maybe he had failed to prevent her brain damage, but succeeded in loving her through it. After they hung up, Lewis sat in his Monaco apartment, looking out at the harbor. The water still made him nervous, but it also looked beautiful in the sunset light. Dr. Hayes had been right about one thing. Emma was living her own life. It wasn't the life Lewis had wanted for her, but it was a life filled with friendship and purpose and happiness. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had always been enough and Lewis just hadn't been ready to see it. The seed of hope that had been planted at the children's hospital was growing stronger. For the first time since he was 12 years old, Louis allowed himself to consider the possibility that he wasn't the villain in Emma's story. Maybe, just maybe, he was exactly who he was supposed to be. London, England. March 20. Lewis Hamilton walked into the coffee shop in Notting Hill feeling nervous in a way that had nothing to do with racing. He was meeting Angela Davis for the first time, and something about her voice on the phone had made him want to be completely honest. Angela was a human rights lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice cases. She had called Lewis's management company asking if he would support a charity that helped families affected by medical negligence. Most celebrities would have simply written a check, but Lewis had asked to meet her personally. "Mr. Hamilton?" Angela stood up from a corner table, extending her hand with a confident smile. She was tall, with intelligent dark eyes and natural hair that framed her face beautifully. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Just Lewis," he said, shaking her hand. "And thank you for the work you do. It sounds important." Angela was different from anyone Lewis had ever dated. She wasn't impressed by his fame or his wealth. She asked thoughtful questions about his charitable work and listened carefully to his answers. When he mentioned his visits to children's hospitals, her eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Why children's hospitals specifically?" she asked. "Most racing drivers support motorsport charities." Lewis felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but something about Angela's directness made him want to try being honest. "I have a personal connection," he said carefully. "My cousin was in an accident when we were children. I've seen how much good medical care can mean to families." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "Was she okay? Your cousin?" "She survived," Lewis said, "but she has disabilities now. Brain injury from drowning." "I'm sorry," Angela said, and Lewis could tell she meant it. "That must have been traumatic for your whole family." Lewis found himself telling Angela more than he had planned. Not everything. He wasn't ready for that yet, but more than he usually shared with anyone outside of therapy. "It changed how I see things," Lewis said. "Made me realize how quickly life can change. How important it is to help people when you can." Angela studied his face with the careful attention of someone used to reading people's motivations. "You blame yourself, don't you, for what happened to her?" Lewis felt exposed, like Angela could see right through his carefully constructed walls. "Why would you say that?" "Because that's what people do when someone they love gets hurt," Angela said gently. "They take responsibility even when it's not their fault. I see it in my work all the time." Lewis wanted to argue, but Angela's words hit too close to home. Instead, he changed the subject to her charity work. But the seed of their conversation stayed with him long after they said goodbye. Over the next few months, Lewis and Angela developed an unusual relationship. It started as professional collaboration. Lewis became a major supporter of her legal foundation, but grew into something deeper. Angela accompanied Lewis to several charity events, and he was struck by how naturally she connected with people. She talked to disabled children with respect rather than pity, asked parents about their challenges without judgment, and somehow made everyone feel heard and valued. "You're good at this," Lewis told her after a particularly successful fundraising dinner. "Better than me. We're good at it together," Angela corrected. "You bring attention to the cause. I bring the legal expertise. It works." Lewis found himself looking forward to their time together in ways he hadn't expected. Angela challenged him intellectually, made him laugh, and somehow made him feel like the best version of himself. But more than that, she made him feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "I'd like you to meet Emma," Lewis said one Saturday, as they walked through Hyde Park. They had been seeing each other for 6 months, long enough for Lewis to trust her with his most important relationship. "Your cousin? I'd love to meet her," Angela said without hesitation. Lewis felt a flutter of anxiety. He had never introduced a girlfriend to Emma before. The two most important women in his life had existed in completely separate worlds. "She's not like other people," Lewis warned. "The brain injury affects how she communicates. She might seem childlike sometimes." "Lewis," Angela said, stopping on the path and taking his hands. "I work with trauma survivors every day. I'm not going to judge your cousin or think less of her because she has disabilities." The visit to Emma's care facility went better than Lewis had dared to hope. Emma was having a good day, alert, talkative, and excited to meet someone new. "You're very pretty," Emma told Angela with her characteristic directness. "Are you Lewis's girlfriend?" "I am," Angela said, smiling.
And you're very pretty too.
Louis talks about you all the time. Emma looked pleased. He visits me every week. He reads me stories and helps me with puzzles. He's the best cousin in the world. Louis felt his throat tighten with emotion. After all these years, Emma still saw him as someone who cared for her rather than someone who had failed her. He is pretty wonderful, Angela agreed, glancing at Louis with soft eyes. You're lucky to have each other. They spent 2 hours at the facility. Angela played board games with Emma, looked at her paintings, and listened patiently to Emma's stories about her friends and activities. She treated Emma like any other adult, not talking down to her or acting like her disabilities made her less than whole. I like her, Emma told Louis as they were leaving. She's nice, and she makes you smile more. On the drive back to London, Angela was unusually quiet. What are you thinking about? Louis asked. Emma, Angela said. She's remarkable. So positive, so full of life. And the way she talks about you, she clearly adores you. She doesn't understand what happened. Louis said automatically. She doesn't remember that I was supposed to protect her and failed. Angela pulled the car over and turned to face him. Louis, listen to me carefully. Emma was 5 years old when she had her accident. You were 12. You weren't responsible for protecting her. You were just a child yourself. I was the older cousin. I should have been watching her more carefully. You saved her life, Angela said firmly. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't acted quickly, she would have died. Instead, she's a happy, functioning adult who clearly loves her life and the people in it. Louis wanted to argue, but something in Angela's voice made him pause. The guilt you carry isn't helping Emma, Angela continued. It's not helping you either. It's just ensuring that one accident ruins 2 lives instead of 1. For the first time in 18 years, Louis allowed himself to really consider what Angela was saying. What if she was right? What if his guilt was serving no purpose except to keep him from being happy? Louis's relationship with Angela deepened over the following year. She was patient with his emotional walls, but persistent in encouraging him to tear them down. She celebrated his racing successes, but made it clear that she loved him for who he was, not what he achieved. I want to build a life with you, Angela told him one evening, as they sat in her London flat. A real life, marriage, children, the whole thing. Louis felt the familiar panic, but it was mixed with something new, genuine desire for the future Angela was describing. I want that too, Louis said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. But I'm scared. Of what? Louis took a deep breath. Of not being a good enough father. Of making the wrong choices. Of failing someone I love the way I failed Emma. Angela cupped his face in her hands. You didn't fail Emma. And even if you had, that was 18 years ago. You were a child. You've learned and grown since then. What if I can't protect our children? What if something happens to them because of my decisions? Then we'll deal with it together, Angela said simply. That's what partners do. You don't have to carry every responsibility alone. For several months, Louis allowed himself to believe that maybe Angela was right. Maybe he could have the family he had always wanted. Maybe love didn't have to mean loss. They started looking at houses together, talking about wedding plans, even discussing names for future children. Louis felt lighter than he had in years, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. But then Emma got sick. It started with headaches and fatigue. Symptoms that her care team initially attributed to stress or changes in her medication. But the symptoms got worse, and tests revealed what everyone feared. Complications from her old brain injury were causing new problems. The damaged tissue is causing seizures, Dr. Williams explained to Louis, David, and Patricia in the hospital waiting room. We can control them with medication for now, but Emma's condition is deteriorating. Louis felt the familiar cold weight settling in his chest. Emma was 28 years old, and the injury he had failed to prevent completely was still causing her suffering. Over the next few months, Emma's condition fluctuated. Good days were followed by bad ones. Progress was followed by setbacks. Louis increased his visits, sometimes staying overnight at the hospital when Emma was having particularly difficult periods. Angela was supportive at first, understanding Louis's need to be present for his cousin. But as the months passed, and Louis became increasingly consumed with Emma's care, their relationship began to strain. You're disappearing again. Angela told him one night when Louis came home exhausted from another hospital visit. "You're using Emma's illness to avoid dealing with our future. That's not fair." Louis protested. "She needs me right now. She has a whole team of medical professionals. She has her parents. She doesn't need you to sacrifice your entire life for her." Louis felt anger flare in his chest. "You don't understand. This is my fault. If I had been faster, stronger, better 18 years ago, she wouldn't be going through this now." "And there it is," Angela said sadly. "You're back to blaming yourself for something that wasn't your fault. I thought we had moved past this." They argued more frequently as Emma's condition worsened. Angela accused Louis of using his cousin's illness as an excuse to avoid commitment. Louis accused Angela of not understanding the depth of his responsibility to Emma. The end came suddenly. Emma died on a Tuesday morning in April, during one of her seizures. Louis wasn't there. He had gone home to shower and change clothes, planning to return in a few hours. She went peacefully, the nurse told him over the phone. No pain, no struggle, just slipped away. Louis felt like he was drowning. Emma was gone, and he hadn't been there to say goodbye. He had failed her one final time. At the funeral, Louis stood next to Emma's casket feeling completely hollow. The church was full of people from her care facility, friends she had made over the years, staff members who had loved her gentle spirit. But Louis could only think about the 5-year-old girl who had wanted to learn to drive race cars, and how he had let her down from the very beginning. David approached Louis after the service. Emma's father looked older than his years, worn down by decades of worry and care. "This is your fault," David said, his voice thick with grief and alcohol. "She never would have suffered if you hadn't tried to be a hero. She would have drowned quickly instead of living 23 years with brain damage." The words hit Louis like physical blows. This was what he had always believed but never heard spoken aloud. Emma's life had been a prolonged suffering because of his inadequate rescue attempt. "David, don't," Patricia said weakly. But her protest lacked conviction. "It's okay," Louis said quietly. "He's right." Louis broke up with Angela that night. He couldn't explain why, couldn't make her understand that Emma's death had proven everything he had always believed about himself. "You're punishing yourself for having the courage to try to save someone," Angela told him through her tears. "That's not justice, Louis. That's just waste." But Louis was beyond hearing reason. Emma was dead, and he was alive, and that felt like the cruelest proof of his failure. He had loved someone enough to imagine a future with them, and now both Emma and that future were gone. Louis understood now why he had always been afraid to love completely. Love meant loss, and loss meant pain too deep to survive. He would never make that mistake again. Colorado, USA, March. The silence in Louis Hamilton's mountain home was absolute. No engines, no crowds, no team radio chatter. Just Louis, sitting alone in his expensive isolation, watching the world shut down around him. COVID-19 had canceled the racing season just as it was beginning. For the first time in his adult life, Louis had nowhere to run, nothing to distract him from the weight of his own thoughts. He had won 5 more world championships since Emma's death, driving with a desperate intensity that worried his team but delivered results. Success had become his armor against grief, achievement his substitute for human connection. But now, trapped in his Colorado home with nowhere to go and nothing to prove, Louis was forced to confront the emptiness that success couldn't fill. The house was beautiful but cold. Modern furniture that looked perfect in magazines, but felt like a museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows that showed stunning mountain views to no one but Louis. Everything was exactly as he had chosen it, and nothing felt like home. Louis's phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family, and colleagues checking on him during lockdown. He answered some of them with brief replies designed to reassure without revealing anything real. "Doing fine. Staying safe. Hope you are too." But Louis wasn't fine. Without racing to consume his thoughts and energy, the grief he had been outrunning for 5 years was catching up with him. He started having the dreams again. Not just about Emma drowning, but about Emma dying. Sometimes she was 5 years old on the beach. Sometimes she was 28 in the hospital. Always, Louis was trying to reach her and failing. He would wake up gasping, his heart pounding, the Colorado silence pressing down on him like a weight. 3 in the morning was the loneliest time in the world. when you had no one to call, no one who would understand why you were crying over someone who had died 5 years ago. Louis tried to stay busy. He worked out until his muscles screamed for mercy. He studied environmental science and social justice, throwing himself into causes that mattered. He posted on social media about Black Lives Matter, about climate change, about inequality. Fighting for other people's justice was easier than facing his own pain. But even activism couldn't fill the hours between midnight and dawn, when Louis lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the ways his life had gone wrong. He started writing in a journal, something Dr. Hayes had suggested years ago that he had never tried. At first he wrote about racing, about politics, about anything except what really mattered. But as the weeks of isolation stretched on, the truth began to spill out onto the pages. Day 47 of lockdown, Louis wrote, "I keep thinking about Emma's laugh. Not the careful, slow way she laughed after the accident, but the wild, joyful sound she made when she was 5. Like wind chimes in a storm. I wonder what she would think of my life now. All these trophies, all this money, all this success, would she be proud? Or would she see what I see? That I've built a perfect life around a hollow center." Angela called today. I didn't answer. She's married now, has a baby daughter. I saw the photos on social media. She looks happy. The kind of happy I'll never be because I'm too afraid to try. The writing became a compulsion. Page after page of thoughts Louis had never spoken aloud, feelings he had buried under decades of achievement and isolation. Day 63, he wrote, "I had a dream that Emma was getting married. She was wearing a white dress and laughing, and she looked exactly like she did before the accident. In the dream, she wasn't disabled at all. She was just Emma, whole and perfect and happy. When I woke up, I realized that I've been mourning the wrong person for 23 years. I've been grieving the Emma who died in the water that day, not celebrating the Emma who lived for 23 more years. After I pulled her out, maybe David was wrong at the funeral. Maybe Emma's life after the accident wasn't suffering. Maybe it was just different. Maybe it was still worth living." Louis began to remember things about Emma that he had forgotten or ignored. How she had learned to paint with her left hand when her right side was weak. How she had made friends at every care facility she lived in. How she had always been excited to see Louis, never bitter about her limitations. Day 78, Louis wrote, "I called Emma's care facility today. Talked to Sarah, one of the nurses who worked with Emma for years. She said Emma talked about me all the time. Called me her racing cousin and bragged to everyone about my championships. Sarah said Emma was proud of me. Not grateful that I visited out of guilt, but genuinely proud of what I had accomplished. She said Emma always believed I would be world champion even when I was just a kid in go-karts. How is it possible that Emma had more faith in me than I had in myself?" The lockdown stretched into summer. Louis's Colorado house became a prison of his own making, but also a place where he finally had time to think without the constant pressure of performance. He started video calling his family more regularly. His father Anthony, now in his 60s, and proud of everything Louis had achieved. His stepmother Linda, still caring for Nicholas, who was now an adult with his own apartment and job. His half-siblings, who had grown up while Louis was traveling the world, becoming people he barely knew. "You sound different," Linda observed during one of their calls. "Sadder. But also, I don't know, more present." Louis knew what she meant. For years he had been physically present but emotionally absent, always thinking about the next race, the next goal, the next distraction from his feelings. Now, with nowhere to run, he was finally learning to sit still with his own thoughts. The most difficult call was to Emma's parents. Louis hadn't spoken to David or Patricia since the funeral 5 years earlier. David's words that day had confirmed everything Louis believed about himself. And Louis had been afraid to face them again. But isolation had given Louis a strange kind of courage. The courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. "David," Louis said when Emma's father answered the phone. "It's Louis. I know it's been a long time." There was a pause. Louis could hear the television in the background, the sound of normal life continuing. "Louis," David said finally. His voice was older, tired. "How are you?" "I've been better," Louis said honestly. "I've been thinking about Emma a lot during lockdown. About what you said at the funeral." Another pause. Lewis wondered if David even remembered what he had said, or if grief had made the words forgettable for everyone except Lewis. "I was drunk," David said quietly, "and angry, and heartbroken. I said things I didn't mean." Lewis felt something shift in his chest. "Did you mean them at the time?" David sighed. "I don't know, maybe." Emma's death felt so unfair. She had worked so hard to build a life, and then it was just over. "I needed someone to blame." "You weren't wrong," Lewis said. "If I had been faster that day in Cornwall, she would have had a normal life." "Lewis." David's voice was firm now. "Emma did have a normal life. It was her normal, not the normal we had planned for her. But it was still a good life. She was happy. She had friends, activities she loved, people who cared about her. Just because it was different doesn't mean it was less." Lewis felt tears running down his face. "But she suffered because of my failure." "She suffered because accidents happen," David corrected. "But she also lived because you didn't hesitate to try to save her. Patricia and I had 23 extra years with our daughter because of your courage." "How is that failure?" The conversation lasted 2 hours. David told Lewis stories about Emma's adult life that Lewis had never heard. How she had volunteered at a local animal shelter. How she had learned to cook simple meals. How she had mentored younger residents at her care facility. "She was proud of you," David said before they hung up. "Always talked about her cousin, the racing driver. She never blamed you for anything. Maybe it's time you stopped blaming yourself." That night, Lewis wrote the longest journal entry of his life. Pages and pages about Emma, about guilt, about the difference between responsibility and blame, about love and loss, and the courage to try even when you might fail. Day 43, he wrote, "I think I've been asking the wrong question for 28 years. Instead of what if I had been faster, maybe I should be asking what if I hadn't been there at all." Emma would have died that day in Cornwall.
No question.
Instead, she lived for 23 more years. She made friends, created art, fell in love with life in ways I never let myself see. I didn't fail Emma. I gave her a chance at a different kind of life. The fact that it wasn't the life I had wanted for her doesn't make it less valuable. Maybe it's time to stop grieving the Emma who never existed and start celebrating the Emma who did. As autumn arrived in Colorado, Lewis began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of achieving the next goal, but the quiet hope that maybe his life could be different. Maybe he could be different. He started therapy again, this time virtually with Dr. Hayes. Their sessions were different now, focused on healing rather than just understanding. Lewis was finally ready to let go of the guilt that had defined him for so long. "I want to try again," Lewis told Dr. Hayes during one session. "Not racing, I'll keep doing that as long as I'm competitive. But the rest of it, relationships, maybe even family someday." "What's changed?" Dr. Hayes asked. Lewis thought about it. "I realized that avoiding love doesn't protect anyone. It just ensures that one accident ruins 2 lives instead of 1. Emma lived fully despite her limitations. Maybe I should try to do the same despite mine." As winter approached, Lewis made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He was going to tell his story publicly. Not all of it, but enough to help other people who might be carrying similar guilt. The interview with Marcus Chen was scheduled for December. Lewis felt nervous, but also relieved. It was time to stop hiding from his past and start building a future. For the first time in 28 years, Lewis Hamilton was ready to stop running from his own heart. Dr. Rebecca Hayes' office. London. January. Lewis Hamilton sat in the familiar chair across from Dr. Hayes, but everything felt different now. After 3 years of virtual sessions during the pandemic, being back in her office felt like coming home to a place he had never expected to miss. "You look different," Dr. Hayes observed, studying Lewis's face with the careful attention she had always given him. Calmer, but also more present. "I feel different," Lewis said. "The lockdown changed something. Forced me to stop running." Dr. Hayes nodded. She had guided Lewis through some of his darkest moments during the virtual sessions, watching him slowly dismantle the walls he had built around his heart. "Tell me about the decision to go public with your story," she said. "That's a big step." Lewis had been thinking about this for months. The interview with Marcus Chen was scheduled for next month, and Lewis felt both terrified and relieved about finally sharing his truth. I realized that keeping Emma's story secret wasn't protecting anyone. Lewis said, it was just keeping me trapped in shame. Maybe if I tell people what really happened, it might help someone else who's carrying similar guilt. What are you most afraid of about telling your story? Lewis considered the question. That people will think I'm making excuses. That they'll see me as weak instead of strong. That they'll understand why I've been so afraid to have children and think less of me for it. And what are you hoping for? Freedom, Lewis said without hesitation. I want to stop carrying this weight alone. I want to see if there's a version of my life where I'm not defined by something that happened when I was 12. Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly. Lewis, we've been working together for a long time now. You've made incredible progress in understanding that Emma's accident wasn't your fault, but I sense there's still something holding you back from fully believing it. Lewis felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but it was different now, less like panic, more like resistance to a truth he wasn't quite ready to accept. I know intellectually that I saved Emma's life, Lewis said slowly. I know that a 12-year-old boy did everything he could in an impossible situation, but knowing it and feeling it are different things. What would have to happen for you to feel it instead of just knowing it? Lewis thought about this question for a long time. It was something he had been wrestling with throughout his healing journey. I think I need to forgive myself, Lewis said finally. Not just understand that I wasn't at fault, but actually forgive the scared 12-year-old who thought he had failed. What would that forgiveness look like? Lewis closed his eyes and tried to imagine it. For 28 years he had carried anger at himself, disappointment in his limitations, shame about his perceived failure. What would his life look like without those feelings? I think it would look like being able to love someone without constantly waiting for disaster, Lewis said. Being able to imagine having children without panic. Being able to make decisions based on hope instead of fear. Dr. Hayes was quiet for a moment, letting Lewis's words settle in the room. You mentioned children specifically, she said. That's been the central fear throughout all of this. The belief that you can't be trusted with a child's safety. Lewis nodded. It's the core of everything. I convinced myself that the kindest thing I could do was never put a child at risk by being their father. But now I'm starting to think that avoiding parenthood isn't protecting hypothetical children. It's just ensuring that my trauma controls my future as much as it controlled my past. This was the breakthrough Dr. Hayes had been waiting for. Not just Lewis understanding his trauma, but Lewis choosing to move beyond it. Tell me about the patterns you've identified in your relationships, Dr. Hayes said. Lewis had been thinking about this a lot during his writing sessions. I always leave first. As soon as someone starts talking about marriage or children or a real future together, I find reasons why it won't work. I convince myself I'm protecting them from my inevitable failure. Can you see the flaw in that logic now? Yes, Lewis said. I was so afraid of potentially hurting someone that I guaranteed I would hurt them. Every woman I've dated who wanted a family, I took that possibility away from them by leaving. Lewis thought about Nicole, about Angela, about all the relationships he had sabotaged before they could reach the point where he might have to trust himself with someone's happiness. The thing is, Lewis continued, I wasn't even giving them a choice. I decided for them that I was too dangerous to love. But that wasn't my decision to make. What would it look like to let someone else make that choice? Lewis felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with hope. Terrifying, but also, maybe worth trying. Dr. Hayes made notes in her journal, then looked back at Lewis with a slight smile. You've done something remarkable over the past few years, she said. You've taken one of the most traumatic experiences of your life and slowly transformed it from a source of shame into a source of strength. How do you mean? Think about it. You saved someone's life when you were 12 years old. You faced an impossible situation and chose courage over safety. Then you spent 28 years visiting Emma every week, supporting her family financially, and working with disabled children. You turned your guilt into service. Lewis felt tears in his eyes. He had never thought about his actions that way. Even your racing, Dr. Hayes continued, can be seen as a response to trauma in a positive way. You channeled your need for control and perfection into becoming one of the greatest drivers in history. You didn't let your trauma destroy you. You used it as fuel, but I also let it keep me isolated. Lewis pointed out, yes, and now you're choosing to change that. That's growth, not failure. Lewis sat quietly for a few minutes, absorbing what Dr. Hayes had said. For so long he had seen his entire adult life as evidence of his damage. But maybe there was another way to look at it. I want to try dating again, Lewis said suddenly. Really dating, not just the surface-level relationships I've had before. I want to be honest about my fears, but not let them control my choices. That sounds like a healthy goal. Any thoughts on how you'll approach it differently? Complete honesty from the beginning, Lewis said. No more hiding behind the Playboy image, or pretending I'm too busy for relationships. If I meet someone I care about, I'll tell them about Emma, about my fears, about why children feel so scary to me, and then I'll let them decide if they want to try building something real with me. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. And if they decide it's too much, if they choose not pursue a relationship because of your history, then that's their choice to make, Lewis said. And maybe it means we weren't right for each other anyway. I'd rather be alone honestly than coupled dishonestly. What about children? If you met someone who wanted a family, this was the big question, the one Lewis had been avoiding for his entire adult life. I think I want to try, Lewis said quietly. I'm still scared. I probably always will be scared of something happening to a child I'm responsible for. But I'm more scared of reaching the end of my life and realizing I let fear make all my important decisions. Dr. Hayes smiled, and Lewis could see pride in her expression. That's remarkable progress, Lewis. You've moved from I can't have children because I'll hurt them to I want to try having children even though I'm scared. That's the difference between trauma controlling your life and you controlling your trauma. Lewis felt something settle in his chest, not the familiar weight of guilt, but a different kind of heaviness. The weight of possibility, of hope, of choosing courage over fear. There's something else, Lewis said. I want to start the Emma Hamilton Foundation, a charity for families dealing with childhood brain injuries. I want to turn our story into something that helps other people. Tell me more about that. I've realized that Emma's life after the accident was meaningful and valuable, even though it was different from what anyone expected. There are thousands of families dealing with similar situations who need support, resources, hope. I want to honor Emma's memory by helping them. Lewis had been thinking about this idea for months. It felt like the right way to transform his guilt into something positive, his pain into purpose. It sounds like you're ready to step out of the shadows, Dr. Hayes observed. To stop hiding from your story and start using it to help others. I am, Lewis said. For the first time in my adult life, I'm ready to stop being ashamed of caring so much about people that I couldn't bear the thought of failing them. As the session ended, Dr. Hayes gave Lewis an assignment that would have terrified him just a few years. I want you to write a letter, she said, to the 12-year-old Lewis who pulled Emma out of the water. Thank him for his courage. Tell him what you wish someone had told him that day. Lewis felt his throat tighten with emotion. I don't know if I can do that. You don't have to share it with anyone. Just write it for him. For the boy who did everything right in an impossible situation and spent the rest of his life believing he had done everything wrong. Lewis nodded, knowing she was right. It was time to show compassion to the child he had been, instead of spending his life punishing him for not being perfect. As Lewis left Dr. Hayes' office and walked through the London streets, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not because his fears had disappeared, but because he was finally ready to face them. The interview with Marcus Chen was 3 weeks away. After that, there would be no more hiding, no more secret shame, no more pretending that his fear of love was actually protection. Lewis Hamilton was finally ready to tell the truth about why he had given up on having children. And more importantly, he was ready to explain why he was choosing to try again. Monaco Cafe, December. Lewis Hamilton sat across from Marcus Chen again. But this time everything was different. The same harbor view, the same gentle sound of waves against the marina. But Lewis felt like a completely different person than the broken man who had walked away from this table 3 years earlier. You said you were ready to tell me the rest, Marcus said gently, his notebook open and pen ready. About why you gave up on having children. Lewis took a deep breath. The story he was about to tell would change how the world saw him. But more importantly, it might help other people who were carrying similar burdens. I was 12 years old, Lewis began, his voice steady now instead of shaking. My family went on holiday to Cornwall. My 5-year-old cousin Emma was there. Blonde curls, huge smile, always laughing. She wanted to learn to drive race cars like me. Marcus listened as Lewis told the complete story for the first time publicly. The beach at Newquay, rip current. Emma's struggle in the water, Lewis's desperate swim to reach her, the minutes underwater that changed both their lives forever. "I got to her," Lewis said, his eyes focused on something beyond the harbor. "I kept her head above water until the lifeguards arrived. But it was too late to prevent brain damage. Emma survived, but she was never the same." "How was she different?" Marcus asked quietly. "She couldn't walk normally. Her speech was slow and careful. She needed help with everything: eating, dressing, basic tasks that she had been learning before the accident. Her whole family's life changed to take care of her." Lewis paused, watching a yacht maneuver carefully into its berth. Even after all these years of therapy, telling Emma's story still required courage. "I blamed myself," Lewis continued. "I was the older cousin. I had promised to watch her. If I had been faster, stronger, better, she would have been fine. Instead, she lived 23 years with severe disabilities because I failed to save her properly." Marcus made notes but didn't interrupt. He could see that Lewis needed to tell this story completely, without questions or comments. "That guilt shaped everything I did afterward," Lewis said. "I used racing to escape from the pain, but I also made a promise to myself. I would never again be responsible for someone's safety. I would never put another person at risk because of my choices or limitations. And that included having children, especially having children," Lewis said. "What if I made the wrong decision as a father? What if I couldn't protect them? What if my choices led to them getting hurt the way Emma got hurt?" Lewis told Marcus about the years of therapy, the relationships he had sabotaged, the walls he had built around his heart. He explained how every girlfriend who mentioned marriage or family triggered his panic, how he had convinced himself that avoiding parenthood was the kindest thing he could do. "I dated wonderful women," Lewis said. "Nicole Scherzinger, Angela Davis, others who could have been amazing partners. But as soon as they started talking about a future together, about children, I found reasons to leave. I told myself I was protecting them from my inevitable failure." "What changed?" Marcus asked. "You said on the phone that you're ready to try again." Lewis smiled, and Marcus noticed it was the first genuine smile he had seen from his friend in years. "Emma died 5 years ago," Lewis said. "Complications from her original brain injury. At her funeral, her father told me it was my fault she had suffered for 23 years instead of drowning quickly as a child." Marcus winced, imagining how those words must have felt. "Those words confirmed everything I had always believed about myself," Lewis continued. "I broke up with Angela that night, convinced that Emma's death proved I brought tragedy to everyone I loved." Lewis told Marcus about the dark years that followed, the isolation, the way success felt meaningless when he had no one to share it with. Then he talked about the pandemic lockdown, the forced solitude that made him confront his grief for the first time. "I started writing in a journal," Lewis said. "Pages and pages about Emma, about guilt, about the life I had built around avoiding love. And slowly, I began to see things differently." The breakthrough had come when Lewis called David, Emma's father, during lockdown. David had apologized for his words at the funeral, explaining that grief had made him cruel. More importantly, he had helped Lewis see Emma's life after the accident in a new light. "David told me that Emma was proud of me," Lewis said, his voice thick with emotion. "She bragged to everyone about her racing cousin. She didn't see her life as a tragedy. She saw it as different but still valuable." Lewis explained how therapy with Dr. Rebecca Hayes had helped him understand the difference between responsibility and blame, between protecting people and controlling outcomes. "I realized that Emma didn't live 23 years of suffering," Lewis said. "She lived 23 years of a different kind of life. She made friends, created art, found joy in simple things. Just because it wasn't the life I had wanted for her didn't make it less meaningful. And that changed how you see having children." Lewis nodded. "I spent 28 years convinced that avoiding parenthood was protecting hypothetical children from my failures. But I was really just ensuring that my trauma controlled my future as much as it controlled my past." Lewis told Marcus about his plans for the Emma Hamilton Foundation, designed to support families dealing with childhood brain injuries. He talked about his decision to be completely honest in future relationships, to let partners make informed choices about loving someone with his history. "I'm still scared," Lewis admitted. "I probably always will be scared of something happening to a child I'm responsible for. But I'm more scared of reaching the end of my life and realizing I let fear make all my important decisions. Marcus had been writing steadily, but now he looked up at Lewis with something like wonder in his eyes. "This is an incredible story," Marcus said. "But I have to ask, why tell it now? Why make this public?" Lewis had been thinking about this question for months, because keeping Emma's story secret didn't protect anyone. Lewis said, "It just kept me trapped in shame. There are probably other people out there carrying similar guilt, convinced they're too damaged to love or be loved. Maybe hearing my story will help them realize that trauma doesn't have to define your entire life." Lewis also talked about his plans for the future. He'd already reached out to several organizations that worked with disabled children, offering his support and resources. He was planning to establish scholarships for children with brain injuries who wanted to pursue adaptive sports. "I want to turn our story into something that helps other people," Lewis said. Emma's life had meaning and value even after her accident. "I want to honor that by supporting other families going through similar challenges." "What about racing?" Marcus asked. "You're moving to Ferrari next year. How does this personal journey affect your professional goals?" Lewis smiled again. "Racing will always be important to me, but it's not my whole identity anymore. I'm not using it to run away from my feelings or prove my worth. I'm racing because I love it, and I'm good at it, but I'm also ready to have a life outside the car." The conversation lasted 3 hours. Lewis told Marcus about the letter he had written to his 12-year-old self, forgiving the scared boy who had done everything right in an impossible situation. He talked about his hope of finding someone to build a real life with, someone who could accept his history and help him create a different future. "I'm not the same person who sat here 3 years ago," Lewis said as their interview wound down. "That man was drowning in guilt and convinced he was too dangerous to love. I'm still carrying some scars, but I'm not defined by them anymore." Marcus closed his notebook and looked at his friend with deep respect. "What do you want people to take away from this story?" Marcus asked. Lewis thought for a moment, watching the sunset paint the Monaco harbor in shades of gold and pink. "That trauma doesn't have to win," Lewis said finally. "That love is always worth the risk, even when you're scared. That sometimes the people we think we failed are actually proud of us for trying." Lewis paused, thinking about Emma's smile, about her excitement when he visited, about her simple wisdom that everyone has hard things to deal with. "Most importantly," Lewis continued, "I want people to know that it's never too late to choose healing over hiding. I spent almost 30 years convinced I was too broken to be a father. Now I'm ready to find out if I was wrong." As they stood to leave, Marcus felt honored to have heard this story. It would be difficult to write, how do you capture 30 years of pain and healing in a newspaper article? But he knew Lewis's courage in sharing it would help other people find their own courage. "One last question," Marcus said as they walked toward the harbor. "If you could go back and change what happened in Cornwall, would you?" Lewis stopped walking and considered the question seriously. 3 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation," Lewis said. "I would have given anything to prevent Emma's accident. But now, I think about all the people she touched in her 23 years after the accident. The friends she made, the staff members who loved her, the other residents she helped at her care facilities. If she had drowned that day, none of those connections would have existed." Lewis looked out at the Mediterranean, no longer seeing danger in the water, but beauty. "I would still wish the accident had never happened," Lewis said. "But I wouldn't change the fact that I jumped in to save her. That 12-year-old boy made the right choice. It just took me 28 years to understand that." As Lewis walked away from the cafe heading toward his Monaco apartment, he felt lighter than he had in decades. The secret that had defined his adult life was no longer secret. The guilt that had shaped every relationship was finally healing. For the first time since he was 12 years old, Lewis Hamilton was free to love without fear controlling every wosi. The boy who had jumped into dangerous water to save someone he loved had finally learned to trust himself with other people's hearts. Lewis's journey from a guilt-ridden 12-year-old to a man finally ready to trust himself with love shows us that it's never too late to choose healing over hiding. His decision to share Emma's story publicly has already helped countless people who carry similar burdens of guilt and fear. The Emma Hamilton Foundation continues to support families dealing with childhood brain injuries, turning one family's tragedy into hope for thousands of others. And Lewis? He's still racing, but now he's also truly living for the first time in decades. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the power of human resilience. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Stories like Lewis's have the power to help someone who might be struggling with their own guilt or trauma. By sharing, you're spreading kindness and awareness, and you never know whose life you might touch. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to choose courage over fear, healing over hiding, and love over the walls we build to protect ourselves. Until next time, keep believing in the power of second chances.